Kartik Krishnaiyer here from the Florida Squeeze, and we're not going to talk about Florida today. This is a special video about Kamala Harris being the presumptive Democratic nominee for President of the United States, and why I have concerns about the influence of Indian diaspora from India in the West, in the UK, US, Canada, and Australia in particular, where there are large numbers of Indian diaspora, but why, in spite of that, I'm a supporter of Senator Harris, Vice President Harris, and why she's different than a lot of the Indian diaspora that I would voluntarily work against or not vote for. Why she's different than the recent British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, among others. Those of you who know me know that I do have a certain pride in my South Asian background, but at the same time, I have grown to believe that India and the way India has evolved as a republic represents a threat to the West. The attitudes of the Indian public, the attitudes of Indian leaders, the attitudes of Indian diaspora within the four nations I mentioned, maybe less so in Canada, but the situation in Canada we're going to get to. That's a big part of my thinking. And maybe I should also acknowledge that one of my issues, specific U.S. Democratic Party issues with the Indian diaspora in the United States, is I feel like the Democratic Party, which I've long associated with because I'm an environmentalist, a big environmentalist, but also I'm more interested in economic issues, far more interested in economic issues than I am in issues of social issues or identity, issues of identity. The Democratic Party, going back to 1896, when William Jennings Bryan and the Populists kind of stormed the convention, Cross of Gold speech, and he's nominated, has been the best mechanism in the political realm for working class Americans, which is at the heart of my political ideology. And my view is Indian Americans have had a lot to do with the Democrats losing some of that class consciousness to where now the lines are blurred, and a lot of working class Americans think maybe they're better off voting for Republicans, which is not something I can abide by. Part of my ideology, this is where I guess I depart with the left on working class issues, is that I believe free trade and open markets is more beneficial to the working class than protectionism and high tariffs. So Trumponomics, or whatever you want to call it, I think is really bad, not just for the United States, but for the West. But let's get back to the actual discussion of India. I don't believe in punishing people for success, but at the same time, Indian Americans, as they call themselves as a group, I don't like that term, but whatever, are the wealthiest subset of the population per capita in the United States. And they have a lot of influence in the Democratic Party today. So there's been a gradual shift of the Democratic Party away from the working class and towards the managerial class, which is what opened the door for Donald Trump and the populists. Which, look, I mean, every reaction has an equal or greater counter reaction, and this is all, like, the Democrats won't assess why they're in the position they're in, right? They just want to blame people and say it's racist, whatever. But Indian Americans are the wealthiest people in this country, and they're by and large Democrats. Help to create a situation where the Democratic Party no longer cares about the working class, or large elements of the Democratic Party no longer care about the working class. But Kamala Harris isn't that way, and she was a co-sponsor of Medicare for All, so that's great. And she's got a very economically liberal record when she was, or economically progressive record when she was in the U.S. Senate. But anyway, I want to get back to the actual subject of India itself. Why Harris, who is partly of Indian extraction, South Indian extraction, is very different than a lot of the other Indian diaspora in the West, and why I have no problem supporting her and enthusiastically supporting her, but I would normally have great reservations about supporting someone of Indian diaspora. Rishi Sunak just lost a landslide election Tories lost a landslide election in the UK, Keir Starmer has come in, Sir Keir Starmer, as the Prime Minister. Sunak is indicative of what I'm concerned about. Okay, Sunak did not defend Britain's interests when it came into collision with India, right? Sunak is married into a very wealthy Indian family. His wife didn't renounce her Indian citizenship until he was running against Liz Truss to be Tory leader. He lost that race, but then he won after Truss' embarrassment, right? Her 30-something days were... it speaks for itself, right? The lettuce jokes. He failed to stand up for the British Broadcasting Corporation, which I know, a lot of Tories, a lot of people on the right in Britain hate the BBC anyway, but failed to stand up for the BBC on its very accurate reporting of illiberal behavior in India. He did a lot, in my estimation, to help to enable the rest of the West to give India a pass for its very overtly pro-Russian policy. And here's the thing about India. India has increased in its hostility to the West. The Indian public and the Indian media, which is very jingoistic and very hostile to any discussion of American or British foreign policy or foreign interests, right? In India, the narrative always is that the U.S. is to blame. The U.S. has exploited the rest of the world, and the British colonized half the world, including them. Now, there are some very valid points to Indian pushback on the colonial legacy of the British, and there are some extremely valid points about the Indian pushback on American multinational corporations and those sorts of things, and the exploitation that goes on globally because of them. However, what India has created is an economic model and a political model which is based around protectionism, jingoism, hostility to the West, and unfettered capitalism, unfettered crony capitalism. So they're really hypocritical when they say these things about the West. And they have now put themselves in their mind, since Narendra Modi and the BJP came to power in 2014, although there were elements of it before that, at the center of the earth. They are the most important country. They are the most important people on the planet. And the diaspora in the West is carrying some of that. And that the rules and consequences should not apply to them because they are the world's largest country in terms of population, the world's largest free market because the Chinese market is restricted, right? So I guess India and the U.S. are the world's largest free market. And they are taking advantage of that position to try and manipulate the West. And there are a lot of Indian diaspora, which probably include members of my own family, that carry this message in the West. Harris is different than this. I'm going to get into that shortly. But let me explain to people what's happened in terms of Indian attempts to conduct assassinations on foreign soil of citizens of the countries that citizens of the countries where they attempted the assassination, or actually carried it out in Canada. Now, of course, these are allegations, very well-sourced allegations, I must say. The Indian government denies it, but we have a situation where Canadian and American sovereignty, in my opinion, have been compromised. And if the Russians did this, if the Chinese did this, can you imagine the ramifications? Can you imagine the reaction? So we had assassinations on Canadian soil that the government of Canada and the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, regardless of what else you may think about him, seems like he gets it from both sides, right? The Conservatives hate him, the Populists hate him, from all sides. The left hates him. But he stood up and stood strong on this assassination. We had an attempted assassination in the United States, which the Department of Justice then indicted some conspirators and an attempted assassination of an American citizen that was opposed to Indian policy. And the Biden administration did nothing. They did nothing They didn't punish India for it. They didn't even raise it. They didn't even create an international incident about it, because I guess India is too big a market and we're paranoid about China. So the Indians can get away with whatever. I mean, they could kill me for all I know. They could send an assassin to kill me, and my government. I've lived my entire life in this country. They wouldn't care. So that's very disturbing. And if compromises our sovereignty. But Kamala Harris, she has a very different take on this stuff, right? I mean, she has alerted Democratic Party officials and Biden officials during the last campaign about the leanings of some of the Indian Americans who, maybe they're big donors and their kids get jobs on campaigns, right? This is how American politics has evolved anyway. As much on the Democratic side now as on the Republican side. It was always more of a Republican issue where donors' kids got jobs. But now, but there are some Indian diaspora, Americans of Indian descent, that were very openly sympathetic towards the Indo-fascist, Hindu fascist regime in New Delhi under Narendra Modi, which is contrary to the values of our American Republic, of democracy, of pluralism, of religious toleration. I don't know how you can be say you're opposed to Trump in the United States and rail against Trump, but then embrace Narendra Modi. In fact, I would say Modi, Viktor Orban, Erdogan, maybe Putin. There's several world leaders that are more dangerous than Trump. I would have actually put Boris Johnson in that category too. And then his successors, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, were, we've talked about Sunak in this conversation, but Truss was an embarrassment. But she wasn't really a fascist. She was just she was what she was. But she was a kind of a crazy free market thinker that didn't want to apply the brakes or have some degree of incrementalism. But here's the issue now when it comes to India. This is a country that is using its diaspora in the West to influence Western policy towards it. And it is a country that I believe is on a collision course with the West for any number of reasons. And this is a problem with other ethnicities, okay? But I'm calling out Indians specifically because I'm of that extraction. And of course, we're talking about Kamala Harris becoming the presumptive Democratic nominee for president and why she's different than a lot of the other diaspora. But this is a problem in the United States as we have foreign agents running wild. We have lobbying groups that are registering as lobbyists for the governments of Turkey and governments of Russia. Maybe they can't do that anymore, but this government, that government. These are all things that chip away at our sovereignty and potentially undermine our values. This is why Donald Trump is such an offensive figure, because it's very obvious to anyone paying attention that Donald Trump is effectively bought and paid for by certain foreign governments and foreign elements. Okay, that's the reality. I know, people say, "Oh, you can't talk about Russiagate," and "Oh, it was a hoax." Okay, I think a lot of the Democratic activists overblew things, but there were certain elements. Not just with Russia. In fact, I think the relationship with Turkey was troubling. That ran through General Flynn also to an extent. And remember when Erdogan made a phone call to Trump? Trump changed American policy overnight in terms of Syria. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others. So I think India seeks this sort of influence, and they are using the diaspora, whether it's in the United Kingdom or in Australia or the United States, to influence the public policy of our country, working potentially, and I think probably, but I'll put the qualifier potentially against our own interests and against our own economic interests, our own domestic political interests. So generally, I would be very cautious about voting for someone who is Indian American, if that's the term they want to use. I don't like this hyphenated American thing, but certainly that seems to be in vogue now. But Kamala Harris is an exception. She's shown in the past that she shares the values that make us liberals in the United States, not necessarily the values that a lot of people of Indian diaspora advocate, right? Maybe that's because she's of a mixed background. Maybe that's just because she's a more worldly person. So I'm enthusiastically backing her, but I want to use this occasion to bring up some very serious issues in terms of where I think things might be going with the Indian diaspora having increasing influence on the domestic politics in the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia, Canada. And in the United Kingdom, you have, I think, the Indian diaspora beginning to vote as a bloc for the Tory party. And that means the Tories, when in power, could be perennially soft on India. And there is a coming confrontation between the West and India. I firmly believe this. And so much of my feeling about this is based on this. And this is a feel I have based on knowing both cultures and knowing the politics in both places. So I know people can write me off after listening to this if they listen to this whole thing as a crank. And as maybe, very ethnocentric. Maybe some people say I'm a white supremacist, right? That seems to be popular to label people as that these days. But which is laughable in my case. But yeah, I'm very concerned about India. I'm very concerned about the Indians. I'm very concerned about them undermining our sovereignty and them using people of Indian diaspora, maybe tugging at their emotion, to undermine our institutions and what's in our best interest. But Kamala Harris is not one of them, and I enthusiastically support her and look forward to casting my ballot for her in the coming months.